Recapping our top story, the federal government has rescinded the digital services tax just a day before it was set to launch. The 3% tax targeted large American tech firms. U.S. President Donald Trump cited the tax when he abruptly halted trade talks with Canada late last week. Federal Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne says the move to scrap the tax will allow those talks to resume, with plans to reach a deal by July 21st. My next guest has been warning for years that Canada's digital services tax could trigger serious trade retaliation from the U.S. Joining us now is Michael Geist. He's the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law at the University of Ottawa, and he joins us from Ottawa this afternoon. So, Michael, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So like we say, you've been warning for years, again this morning, even in a piece that you wrote, warning that this tax would trigger trade retaliation from the Americans, from the U.S. side here. But yet Canada's federal government seemed to sort of move forward to try to carry on despite that. So what do you make out of what has happened in recent days?
Well, I think for several years, as you point out, there have been concerns about the prospect of retaliation around this digital services tax. And so it's not purely a Trump issue. This dates back to the Biden administration. It was a concern for members of Congress in the United States, both Republican and Democrat. So the risks have been pretty clear. And I think if there's a concern beyond the way Canada played this out, which I think really leaves them in a bit of a weakened position when it comes to the negotiation. And frankly, they had a pretty significant card to play with this tax that they've now just used to try to get the U.S. back to the table. But more broadly, they've consistently underestimated the risks and potential consequences of some of their digital policies. And it's come back to bite, not just in this case, but on a number of past occasions as well.
And maybe just help us here for people who are still sort of learning about this tax. Bring us up to speed on what some of those risks were and why lawmakers south of the border, seemingly on both sides of the aisle, why they were so against this.
Right. So there's a number of different taxes that are at play with these companies. Several years ago, we put forward digital sales taxes. So people who subscribe, say, to Netflix pay tax. The companies already pay their traditional, say, income tax on their revenue. This is designed to be an extra tax, taxing some of the revenues that they would generate on things like using Canadian data or running digital ads or online marketplaces. And there are a number of other countries that have put a similar thing in place, but it's always faced pretty significant opposition from the United States on the premise that if more tax dollars are going to another country, less may be going to the U.S. So they've often opposed it on simply on those grounds. There have been efforts to craft an international agreement around this, to find a mechanism to make it work. But Canada basically ran out of patience, and they said, we want the revenues. We want to move ahead. And if we're not going to put this agreement in place now, we're going to move ahead with the DST. And that, for a number of years, raised real ire amongst the U.S., where if you're trying to deal with some of these trade-related issues, creates a particular risk.
You mentioned that international approach or international effort to create something. There's also been the UK's approach of reducing that tax, negotiating it as part of a broader trade deal. Do you think that Canada ultimately needs some sort of digital services tax? Do you think that we will see it move ahead with something that looks a little bit differently in the future?
Well, certainly not in the short term. I mean, it's pretty clear Canada is going to rescind this digital services tax. And, it's unlikely that as part of any sort of deal with the U.S., that issue is going to be reopened. You mentioned the U.K., and you're right. The U.K. does have a digital services tax. It's valued at less than the Canadian one. It's 2% rather than 3%. And Canada made the somewhat odd and certainly a bit controversial decision to make its tax retroactive. So, in fact, when it was scheduled to take effect today, it would have dated back 3 years. So we were talking about billions of dollars as it dated back to transactions that took place many years ago. But the way the UK approached it was to say, listen, this is part of a broader overall trading framework with the United States, and we'll negotiate the role that a digital services tax might play alongside any number of other issues. When Canada said, we're moving ahead and requiring payments on this on June 30th, in the middle of those negotiations, they basically played the card. They said, listen, we want that money now. And it, in many ways, invited a response that shouldn't surprise anyone, with the U.S. escalating and saying, well, if that's the case, we're not negotiating at all. Canada basically forced to get itself back to the bargaining table by dispensing with the tax altogether.
I know it's hard to sort of understand the U.S. president, where he's coming from on all of this, but do you think that he genuinely cares about the policy, or do you think that there's a chance here that part of this was about protecting some of his allies within that U.S. tech industry?
Well, I think those are probably one and the same. I suspect that there was, a lot of corporate pressure. We were seeing it, frankly, both in Canada and the United States, including by Canadian companies that were concerned about moving ahead with this tax, because it didn't only affect U.S. tech companies. There were Canadian companies that would have been affected by this as well. And so when he's got some of these powerful companies saying, hey, this is going to run into the billions of dollars and may reduce U.S. tax revenues as a result, no surprise that we would see the U.S. president say, I'm going to find whatever mechanism I can to try and stop it from happening. That writing has been on the wall for some time, and the Canadian government, for whatever reason, consistently downplayed some of those risks.
Just finally here, Mike, with a little bit of time we have left, what would you like to see Canada do now on this front moving forward? Because, of course, it was estimated we would bring in some $7 billion over 5 years if this tax had been brought in. A lot of lost revenue there. So what would you like Canada to do going forward?
Well, listen, I think that the decision was made that the lost $7 billion was outweighed by the benefits of getting a broader trade deal with the United States. And so getting them back to the negotiating table was critically important. So that's why that decision was made. In terms of tax policy, obviously the government was going to have to sort out how they pay for various programs, but it's on tech policy where I think we need a bit of a rethink, because in that sense, this, as I mentioned, is not the first time that we've seen government effectively say, well, we're going to call your bluff. We don't think you're really going to walk away from the negotiating table, or in the case of the online news bill years ago, walk away from linking to news stories. It turns out it's been a bad bet pretty consistently. And so that misread of tech companies, both in terms of the costs of Canadian regulation and their willingness to say, we're just going to pay whatever costs that you put into place. I think we've erred, at least on a number of occasions now, and need a policy that I think is more realistic about the consequences of some of those regulatory plans.
Michael, great to speak with you as always. Thank you so much for joining us on this.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Michael Geist for us.